Hello, I'm Nicholas Henschel. I'm the Vicar of St Thomas's in Groombridge in the High Weald of East Sussex. And this is session 4 of this year's Lent course, but I hope it's also more widely useful. We're going to be focusing on Luke. But as I've been producing 2 videos each week, could I encourage you this week to actually at least watch both of them? Because in past weeks, sometimes it's been either or. This week, it's very much both and. Because, of course, Luke is unique. Luke is not simply the author of the Gospel, but the author of the Acts of the Apostles. It is a 2-volume work, and of course that changes in a sense, talking about either Luke or the Acts of the Apostles. But in this first part, this first video, we're very much definitely going to be having a good look at Luke's Gospel. Now, a poor joke suggests that Anglicans love Luke's Gospel because it's full of stories. Okay, it is the case that Luke's Gospel has a range of parables and incidents found nowhere else in the New Testament. The lost son, the Good Samaritan, and much distinctive material in the account of Jesus' death. All of that is of clear interest. Nothing is accidental. Further, with very few exceptions, almost all commentators agree that Luke's Greek is the second best Greek in the New Testament. Hebrews is almost certainly in the best Greek in the New Testament, but that deep sense that he's a very good writer, highly organised, as he says from the beginning. It's often been suggested that Luke is the preacher's gospel par excellence because he's a great storyteller. And again, that's partly to undersell and misunderstand Luke's purpose. And a further complexity is that Luke is more different in purpose and message than we assume because of its overlaps with Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark are remarkably similar. I know we can say that 90% of Mark is included both in Matthew and in Luke, but Luke diverges from the theological and other emphases in those Gospels far more than we think, simply because it has the same shape. Luke's known as one of the synoptic Gospels, the 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, because that word synoptic is a Greek word that means looking from the same perspective. And of course, as they do look from the same perspective, they also, where they differ, tell us something very, very interesting. The unique material is where we find the discoveries. Luke is, of course, and I say this I hope every week, is not telling a different story from Matthew and Mark. It is essentially the same structure, tidied up because Luke is very interested in structure and order, and certainly made more elegant. Luke says at the beginning that he's writing an orderly narrative. I suspect he has Mark and Matthew, Mark in particular, in view here. Not that Mark is disorderly exactly, but Mark's stress on the urgency of what's happening often leaves behind grammar and elegance. So Luke is orderly in his account. He says that from the beginning, and he certainly follows it up. And the portrait of Jesus' teacher in Matthew's Gospel does not match Luke's sense of his theological purposes. So Luke is different as well as very similar to Matthew and Mark. And as we've said already, that despite, alongside those, there is this one huge obvious difference, that Luke's Gospel is unique in being a 2-parter. The Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. These are not separate books, so to speak, and one single narrative. That changes the nature of the Gospel, of course, but it also changes the missiological focus and purpose of Luke's Gospel. Note that the last recorded words of Jesus in Luke's writing, this is in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1, verses 8, Jesus says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." Luke has in view not simply the biography of Jesus, but tracing the impact of Christ's death and resurrection on his followers as they go out and announce good news to the ends of the earth. It also means that Luke is, of course, the largest single contributor to the New Testament. He writes more of the New Testament than any other writer because of the 2 books. But that map from Jerusalem to Samaria to the ends of the earth, toward Judea then to the ends of the earth, is very much the structure of the Acts of the Apostles, as we'll see in the second video. The Gospel and Acts are written by the same person. It is assumed by almost all commentators. I'm sure there's somebody somewhere who says, no, I'm sure they're different. The two books have similar literary style, and certain themes can be traced throughout. Both books begin with prologues and dedications to a certain man called Theophilus, although is he a real person or not? The man just means the name just means lover of God. And the prologue in Acts is a brief but fitting description of the contents of what what could be called the first book. They refer to the first book, the Gospel. Certainly most modern scholars agree that that's what's going on. This is the same author of both books. However, whether it's the person who's identified in the Acts of the Apostles called Luke as the companion of Paul is certainly open to question. As an author, as we've said, Luke is highly regarded. His literary skills in comparison with the other New Testament writers, very, very fine. He understands the use of rhetoric. He's careful in the construction of narrative. He's consistent in his characterization and use of themes. A really skilled author. Although Luke includes several statements about the consummation of history, as do Matthew and Mark, his gospel has a much less focus on the end of time. He's very much focusing on patience. He cautions against people who proclaim that the end has come. Luke very much emphasises that the end isn't going to happen immediately. The end is not yet, is one of the big points he makes. Central to Luke's gospel is Jesus' concern and care for oppressed people, especially women and the poor. This is not simply expressed in terms of sympathy. In this gospel, Jesus has as many words about the duty of the rich towards the poor as he has words of reassurance for the poor. So he's very concerned about the nature of society and the relationship particularly between those who are at the bottom and those who are at the top. He tells parables, for instance, the Pharisee and the publican. Two men go up to pray at the temple. One's a Pharisee, one's a sinner. And the Pharisee says, I thank you that I'm not like this awful sinner behind me, but I'm justified by you. And the publican says, well, I know I'm not even worthy to be here. And then Jesus says, which went home justified? Which one went home put right by God? Not the Pharisee, the one who had humility. That's very characteristic. It's only in Luke's gospel that we find things like the parable of the Good Samaritan and the lost son. These are extraordinary narratives exploring God's amazing, boundless generosity that, like the father in the parable of the lost son, he will welcome home his son without condition. And of course then tells the story of the older son who's just resentful of that. And Jesus is asking, where do we stand in that? Are we with the generosity of God or the bitterness of the elder son? In the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus goes to an extraordinary point where he tells this most famous of his stories, where the hero is not the priest or the temple official. They pass by on the other side, quite literally. No, it's a Samaritan. Now let's remind ourselves who Samaritans were. Samaritans, even today in modern Israel, will not relate to Jews in any way, speak with them, eat with them, that they are seen as heretics. And they certainly were in those days. A Jew had absolutely nothing to do with Samaritans. So when the first hearers of the parable of the Good Samaritan hear it told by Jesus, when he says, and then along came a Samaritan, they'll think, oh, he's really going to do for this bloke. Oh no, what, he helps him out? That's deeply, deeply shocking. In Luke's gospel, there's a big stress on the stranger, the person you don't agree with, the person on the other side of the line, being actually the person God is calling, the person God is making righteous. In Luke's chapter 4 and 5, Jesus preaches this extraordinary sermon, or reads from Isaiah rather, in the synagogue, and people think that's amazing. But then he stirs them up and makes them very, very angry by saying, you think you're really blessed and righteous? Well, in the days of Naaman the Syrian, there were loads of lepers, but God only healed him. And in the days of other prophets, there were lots of widows, but Elisha only went to one of them, i.e. foreigners and followers of other gods are more righteous than you are. Unsurprisingly, the people in the synagogue get very, very angry and try to throw him off a cliff. So Luke's gospel, for all its great writing, is also incredibly radical. In Luke's gospel, I think it's therefore unsurprising that the kingdom of God in Luke is always pictured as God's gracious gift, a gift without limit. And Jesus himself is constantly portrayed as loving, kind, and the doer of good deeds. Of course, there are lots of similarities as we note, between Luke and the other two synoptic gospels, but there is so much in Luke that is distinctive. the boy Jesus in the temple at the age of 12, the raising of the widow of Nain's son. We've spoken about this earlier in this course. That's an extraordinary moment. Jesus touches the coffin of a dead person, making himself unclean by the Jewish law so that he can stand with a grieving widow. Now that's radical. That's radical, not found in any other of the Gospels. His conversations with Martha and Mary. Remember, the point of the incident between Martha and Mary is that Mary isn't sort of being lazy listening to Jesus. She's taking the role of a disciple, which of course was forbidden to a woman. So again, Luke is telling us something extraordinary about how radical Jesus is in crossing boundaries. Again, Zacchaeus, Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem, and the little man, the short man Zacchaeus, the tax collector, climbs a tree to see Jesus. And Jesus doesn't just say, "Come down." He says, "I must stay in your house today." He makes Zacchaeus his host. He's crossing an extraordinary boundary, staying with somebody, an outcast from his own people because he's a tax collector. And yet Jesus blesses him and asks him to be his host. So there is an extraordinary amount in Luke that points us to the poor, the vulnerable, the needy. That's even true in the Passion narratives. In the Passion narratives, only in Luke do we have that picture of Jesus forgiving those who crucify him. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? Jesus very much in Luke's gospel as the friend of our frailty, the one who walks beside us in our need, the one who knows better than we are what it means to be loved. And of course, in his resurrection appearances, Luke places those in a very distinctive place, including that remarkable narrative of the two people going home on the first Sunday afternoon on the road to Emmaus, and the third one who comes to walk beside them. There is this deep sense of a God who loves us, and in Jesus Christ, a God who makes that love known in a very unique way. Some unique lines only found in Luke's Gospel. "Father, forgive them because they do not know what they're doing." To the penitent thief when he's on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." And then, unlike Matthew and Mark, whose last words for Jesus are, my God, why have you forsaken me?" quoting from Psalm 22, Luke quotes Jesus quoting from another psalm, Psalm 31. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." A deep sense of not resignation, but confidence in God's purposes, the same words that Stephen uses in the Acts of the Apostles. Let me finish, so to speak, at the beginning with the opening narratives of Luke's Gospel. It's very easy to think, because we mash them together at Christmastide, that the birth narratives of Matthew and Luke are the same, when of course they're radically different. Matthew is the one with the kings, that's the one with the wise man, and Luke has a much more extended narrative around shepherds and angels and wise and contact between Mary and her cousin. I'll say more about that in a moment. And also this big theme of virginity. Now in Luke, this is really clear. In the Old Testament, virginity is always a bad word. I think I probably said this when we talked about Matthew. For Luke, therefore, it's really important that Mary is seen as a virgin because she's exactly the wrong kind of person to be the mother of God. And therefore, in terms of the Jesus we find in Luke's Gospel, where the upside-down values of the kingdom means the first are last and the last are first, then a virgin is exactly the right person to be the mother of God. You get it? You get it? I mean, it's really radical stuff. Also, a distinction between the birth, the genealogies, there's lists of names at the beginning of Matthew and Luke. A big contrast here is that in Matthew, the genealogy of Jesus is traced from Abraham. That's fine, how's that? In Luke, it's traced from Adam. Oh, right. So in Matthew, it's all about the Jewish nation and the bloodline from Abraham. In Luke, it's about the first human being, the origins of the human race. Oh, right. And that's matched, of course, later in the gospel in Jesus' words about being with them to the end of time, and also the spread of the gospel to the whole inhabited earth. This is about everybody in all places, at all times. Maybe it's best summed up by Jesus' use of the Old Testament. This is from Luke chapter 4. his first words of teaching, so to speak. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. So that's just a little insight, I hope helpful, into Luke's gospel and how it's distinctive. The rest of the narrative, very, very similar, but it's where he doesn't coincide with Matthew and Mark that we need to take note. And it's above all in his depiction as God as the friend of our frailty, Jesus as the person who knows more deeply than we do our own sense of loss and brokenness, the slum within, as one great writer used to call it, and comes into that mess precisely to lead us to a new way of living and the vision of his glory, which is accomplished through his cross and resurrection. This is the end of that first video. The second video will follow, which will very much be focused on the Acts of the Apostles, a book probably quite closed to all of us, but which is worth getting opened and drilling down in, because it's got some extraordinary material that may help us understand both early Christianity and God's call on us today.